Hey, everybody, can you see me? Can you hear me? Any feedback? Yes, perfect. So, thanks for the patience. We had some little technical issues. You know, probably it's our first virtual meetup this time. So, as you can see, we are streaming live from Nuremberg, which is in my bag. Just a quick question. Where are you all from? That's the first thing which actually interests me, because we have like an international audience right now. We can stream internationally. We have international speakers. So just post into the chat where you're from. Nuremberg, great. Italy, yeah. Where from Italy? Or anyone else? Venice, nice. Okay, the others? Wow, nice. Taiwan, Poland, great. Okay, cool. So, under Franken. Okay, so yeah, I've prepared actually. As we are from Nuremberg, I obviously have to drink my beer. And this is not sponsored. And my pretzel. So nothing can go wrong from my side. So now I'd like to introduce you to our speakers. There was a little switch in the schedule. So the schedule, as you could see, announced Felix as first speaker, but we just switched the schedule, so Majid will be the first speaker. All right. Majid, are you ready?
Absolutely.
Perfect. So, yeah, Majid, happy to have you here. Thanks.
Thank you.
Oh, wait, I nearly forgot something. I have to switch places from Nuremberg to Oslo.
Welcome to Oslo.
All right. Thanks a lot for joining us today. The first time I met you was actually on Flutter Europe, which was a great event. As we probably all know, or lots of us know. So there was also where I listened to your talk, and it was great. Thanks for that. And so for me, it was actually clear that I wanted to have you both on a stream here. And so Majid, I know that you are an organizer of GDG Oslo, a co-organizer, an organizer of more others meetups in Oslo. Could you probably introduce yourself, because you can do it better than I can?
Yes, yes, sure. My name is Majid, as you said. I am a passionate developer just like you. And also, I do a lot of things regarding the organizing meetups and conferences. I do organize Flutter Oslo, GDG Oslo, Mobile Oslo. And also we have a couple of conferences in Oslo, Mobile Era, you may have heard. Also we have NG Viking, I'm one of the organizers. Nice. And a few others. So I'm very, very into the community. I really like to contribute to community in any way that I can. So meetups and conferences are one way. And also I'm a speaker. As you see, I regularly speak, especially about Flutter and PWA. This is my two passion. And I also have written a book. So I'm going to show it actually in my slide later. And today, well, that is the talk that you mentioned I gave in Flutter Europe, but with a lot of modification. I have received a lot of feedbacks and a lot of contribution actually to the repo. Thanks to everyone who contributed. And then we now have maybe a better slides and also like presentation, as well as code base and architecture for both simple apps and a little bit larger apps like enterprise apps, which initially was my target, but now I also can propose to smaller and simpler apps. And we're going to talk about BloC a lot. So then the next talk will be awesome. So you have to stay and then you have to watch Felix afterwards, because in my talk, my favorite, of course, my favorite library is BloC, and then you have to listen to Felix afterwards, definitely. So happy to start.
Yeah, cool. Again, happy to have you here, so go for it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So then let's get started. Just show me like a red, like a green light if everyone sees my slides right now.
Yes.
All right, perfect. Then let's get started. As you see here, I'm going to talk about strategic domain-driven design today, and see how actually DDD can help to improve our architecture. Then I will come up with some architecture proposal for you for both enterprise and simple apps, which of course I have implemented in my apps during the last 1.5 years when I started working with Flutter. And then this is mostly my experience. So let's get started. So as I mentioned, I upgraded everything this month. So even if you have heard about my talk in Flutter Europe, you still may see a few new topics here. So it's not gonna be the same as I gave this talk in Flutter Europe. Let's move on. So when we are actually building a software, we're gonna have like a lot of things that we need to figure out. We need to talk to business, we need to talk to other developers, maybe other teams, a lot of things that we need to take care. And of course, well, when it comes to software development or maybe app development, we will actually learn from all of those experiences that people share with us, like with blogs and a lot of things. So, but of course, sharing experience is great, but we will always get back to best practices. And sometimes we combine these best practices and create patterns. And when we actually add a little bit of philosophy to all of this, then we create methodologies. So here is one of those methodologies, so domain-driven design, which it says that it's here to help us to tackle complexity of the software development. But let's see here today why we need domain-driven design, why I'm actually talking about this, why I really like the DDD and how it can help us. So most of the theory behind the talk about the strategic domain-driven design is from, of course, the main book, the blue book, Eric Evans. So you may have heard or you have read that already, and 2 other books, which is like a complementary to this book. There are other books as well, Professional DDD and also the Implementing DDD. So you can also go through Amazon or other book library and get and read that if you are interested to read more. So, but imagine the first book is around like maybe 700 pages, and each of the other books are around 700 pages. I'm not able to summarize maybe 2,000 pages in 30 minutes or 40 minutes. It's a lot of things that needs to be discussed, and a lot of ideas and a lot of theory here, as well as a lot of practical examples. But we're gonna go through some of them. But the reason that I really like DDD is that when we start a project, it is very, very like a normal chart you may have seen in your career so far. So we have, of course, sometimes like a resource capacity is limited or it's fixed, and then as project is growing, so the complexity of the project also grows. That is very obvious. But what DDD helps us and promises us is to at least tackle this complexity until it can be manageable for the team and the whole organization. That is the promise. So of course it depends on like how you implement it, how you know take advantage of it, a lot of things. But that is what it says to us. But why and when DDD can help, like especially in Flutter app, let's say. But let me tell you this. When we are talking about Flutter app, maybe we can categorize it in 4 different categories, let's say. The apps or software in general that they are dealing with data, the big data and other things. Some apps or some softwares, they need just performance, and some of them they have like a business logic, a complex business logic, like ERP system, a lot of things that needs to be handled there. And some of the apps are just a technical complex, they have just technical complexity, right? Like you need to come up with an algorithm to solve a problem, and that's not a business, it's just a technical complexity. When DDD shines is where your app or your software is focusing on business logic complexity, or there is business logic complexity. So if your app doesn't have this complexity, you should probably not even look into the DDD at all. So we're talking about this layer of complexity when we are talking about DDD. And DDD is a great example of a combination of 2 great principles of software. YAGNI, you're not going to read it, and KISS, which is keep it short and simple. And probably right now, many of you just say like, well, DDD is a very, very complex topic. So, and you're saying that keep it short and simple. Well, of course, we're talking about like a very big system, right? And in this talk, of course, we're going to take advantages of these principles, but the main important thing is that we want to be inspired by DDD. We're not going to actually implement the whole DDD, you know, things into a one Flutter app, but we're going to be inspired and see how it can help us. That is very important. So at the end of this talk, I will show you some proposal regarding the architecture as well as folder structure and etc. And you see that I will tell you that this is not just a hard rule you have to follow, but you need to be inspired and then take advantages of it and then change it in a way that it works for you. So very quickly, summary about the talk today. Of course, we're gonna go through DDD. If you're not familiar with the concept and the terms, the most important ones, we go through it today very quickly, and don't worry about it, you will learn about it today. Strategic domain-driven design is one part of the DDD, so which is the main focus of this talk. We're gonna talk mostly about the theories, of course, not the implementation, how you have to write a code. That is mostly up to you, and that's completely different. But the most important part of part of this talk is to show you how you can leverage a strategic domain-driven design to architect your app or close yourself to the business. And then I'm gonna have 2 proposals for you: enterprise architecture and then a simple architecture, which I have implemented in my simple apps, and it works for me very well. For sure, we're gonna see the demos as well. So I don't think I need to introduce again myself, but that was my plan to introduce at this time. You know, just ask me in the beginning of the talk. So I guess you all know me right now. So I'll just move on to the next slide. Let's go back to the DDD. What is domain-driven design? The domain-driven design is telling us when we develop a software, actually, the main focus, usually we as a developer, we are very geek. We want to just sit and write code, you know, but the DDD says that this is the technology we're using. It's not the things that you need to focus, probably. It's the business things that you need to focus. And of course, there are business problems that these softwares that we are writing codes for or we are creating, they're going to solve those problems. So for writing those code and building these apps, we of course need to understand our clients' needs, right? So, and when it comes to the client's need and our software, then of course the domain is very important. The domain is where this software is going to serve. That is the core domain in DDD. So let's go back to the DDD and two parts of it. So DDD has, as proposed in the book, has two parts: strategic design tools and tactical design tools. The strategic part is mostly focusing on the theories and how you should create your domain, your core domain, your subdomain, context, and etc. that we are going to go through today. And the tactical part is mostly dealing with the implementation and writing code, how you have to organize your code, write your function, the name of function, and etc. So very deep. So we're not going to touch that today. It's very little time for this talk, but we go through the strategy part of that now. So imagine that in a strategic part of the domain-driven design, why I think it's so important is that because when you are planning to create a city, and if you have a plan, if you have a strategy how to create it, you may end up creating a city like the picture on the right. It seems like modules, and you know, it's very organized, that they have ways to each other, no colliding, so you clearly see the path. But on the left side, well, of course, when there is no plan, everyone can create everything. So maybe in the beginning, 1, 2, 3 house is great, but then when you have millions of house, then you will end up having a mess. That's why the strategic part of the domain-driven design is very important. So we need to very seriously take into account when we build our software. And as I show you in the picture, the strategic part is mostly about decomposing. So decomposing your software into the different subdomains, and of course you need to understand your core domain. And what is the core domain? The core domain is where you are building software to serve the business, to solve the problem. Even if you are a software company, still you have a core domain in your company. And well, let's give an example. For instance, if there is a veterinarian office, for instance, the core domain is like serving and helping pets and people, you know, and etc. But of course, the software here, the core domain is quite broad and very big. So we need to take it to the smaller piece that we can manage it. So that this veterinarian could have employees management, could have appointment management, maybe something else, you know. So these are finding these subdomains that there is a problem there and you need to solve it, right? So another example is, let's say we want to build a manufacturer app. So we want to help a manufacturer to have an app to solve their problem here. So we're going to have, of course, different subdomains here. We're going to have sales, accounting, product catalog, marketing, manage employees. These are, and maybe more, these are the subdomains of this main core domain app, let's say. So when it comes to these subdomains, when we are going to solve a problem, then each of these subdomains may have their own entities. But of course, these entities can also be shared. Like for instance, in sales, we have customer in employee department or subdomain. We have customer marketing, we have customer accounting, we have customer, and these are our customer, same ID. But the thing is that each subdomain, they have their own interpretation of these as customer. So the customer in sales, they are interested in different things. They are maybe interested in the interest of the user. But in the marketing or maybe in accounting, they are very interested in their payment method and how much they paid, you know. And in employees, maybe customer is very important to know about the emails and names and etc. When we are actually creating these isolated of entities and these problems that we are going to solve here with the solutions, then we are creating these bounded contexts. So you can imagine that in our app, we can actually create these bounded contexts by maybe namespace or maybe folder, maybe different project. So you can think of it like this. And each bounded context, it's going to have a ubiquitous language. When I say ubiquitous language, the first thing it came to the mind is that, okay, that means everyone should speak one language. Well, that's not going to work. The ubiquitous language in domain-driven design is meant to be isolated into the bounded context. So that means, so if you are in sales and you are talking about customer, everyone in that sales, including your product owner, developers, business, everyone should talk the same language. You need to unify this language between stakeholders and developers and business, and that is very important. So when in sales or when in employee subdomain or like that folder, you're talking about a customer, everyone, including the product owner and business, should understand what you're saying. And also you need to reflect this on your code. You should not have something on the map or on the page, and then you write a different name on your code. That is what we are talking about, this ubiquitous language. But there is no such a software that every single subdomain is isolated and they don't need to talk each other. That's impossible, right? So we need to these subdomains and bounded contexts, they need to actually talk to each other. So, and when they actually go and talk to each other, they're asking about some information. That is when we are creating the context map. There are different ways of doing that as proposed in DDD. For instance, if we let all the subdomains, in this case here, bounded context, I correct myself, if we let all the bounded contexts talk to each other in any way, then we will end up have a mess, right? So we should have a better plan. We should have something that works better here. One thing that is suggested, and I really like, and I think it works in Flutter app too very well, is shared kernel. You just think of it as a common module or a common folder that contains all the common things that you need to use in different part of your application. And of course, all the different developers, or maybe if you have more teams working on one app, maybe they all can contribute to this shared kernel. This is one example here is like user authentication. That is something that should be shared between all the subdomains. So everyone can log in and get access or be authenticated and authorized, right? That works very well, but then it comes to a way that if everyone wants to actually take care of one thing or one common thing, then it's gonna be a little bit risky because, well, you rely on me to fix this bug and then I wait for you because you are also responsible, and then at the end of the day, nobody does that, right? Maybe sometimes we need to come up with a better idea. And one of the things that actually is proposed in DDD is creating an open host service. That is a tiny or a thin layer in each bounded context that has a public interface to other bounded contexts. So if you need to get something from sales, from order, instead of going through the whole subdomain, whole things, you just go through this API. Okay, I translate OpenHOST service to our language. That is actually an API. So you just go through the API, and that is a public API, which more or less stay the same always. So if you want to change everything under the hood, it's fine. You can change it, but your public API for other bounded context remains the same always. So, but Eric once created this navigation map. He called this navigation map. You see that it's a lot of things in this map, and a lot of theory that we need to learn about it. Of course, I'm not also an expert in DDD, just sharing my experience, how I used it. And what I explained right now, and I'm gonna actually use it, is only a few part of it. And if you want to learn more, definitely you should get back to the book and all the other books and tutorials and read more about it. And try to see an actual implementation of all of these things in this map. Okay, but how that could help in Flutter? Right. Let's talk about the enterprise app. I'm talking about an app that is super big. I was part of an app which we developed over a year, and that has a lot of screens, like maybe around 600 or 700 by now. And it's a very complex app, a lot of logic, and also it's an IoT app, which means it also has AI things inside the app. A lot of things is happening in this app. And many developers were part of developing this app. So then when we started maybe a year and a half ago, and then, well, at that time, Flutter was quite new, no architecture, or at the moment, if you search, you will find probably a lot of different things for Flutter too, but at that time, it was a little. So we came up with our ideas and how we can create an architecture that work for us. So then we could do this way. So this architecture is very, very similar to Onion architecture plus Clean architecture from Uncle Bob, and inspired by layer architecture and the some part of these two architecture as well, like combining three different architecture. As I say right now, again, you can definitely choose maybe just Clean architecture. That's of course well known, and maybe you should stick on that. There is also Onion architecture. There is also layer architecture. But this is what we did in our app, very close to these solutions. But I like to share this and show you how we did it, so you may learn and continue learning afterwards. We split our app to the different subdomains, as I said. So that is what I'm suggesting. So if you are creating like an e-commerce app, you can create your sales subdomain, you can create your catalog or common folder, as I mentioned. So the first layer here, so the enterprise architecture, we're gonna have 4 layers. So the top layer is presentation layer. Of course, what I'm proposing here is to create screens, widgets that have UI, and of course logic holder. My favorite logic holder here for managing the state is of course BloC. So in the simple architecture, I'm going to talk more about BloC here. And so you create your smart UIs where you want to have these screens and show based on the route. Maybe they have a route and they show something, and then maybe you also have some widgets which is shared between these screens too. So, and the second layer is application layer, where you have your facade pattern. That means you're simplifying all the other layers underneath to a very simplified layer, that presentation layer, and later API has access to it. So then the third layer is your domain layer. That is the most important part of these layers for each subdomain, because what they do, they are completely isolated and they just know about this domain. They know about the interfaces that we are going to create for this domain, entities, object values, and logics. Everything here in this layer. None of the other layers, this layer cannot get anything from other layers, but other layers can definitely get access to it and know about this domain. Okay, good. And the last and the fourth layer is infrastructure, where you get the data. So it's that the data layer is where you are asking for different source of data, local data, remote data, geolocation, or other stuff. You create your model, you serialize, deserialize, and at the end of the day, you have a repository that also can combine different data sources and decide what to send up to the application layer. So for instance, if you have a connectivity problem in your app, and if you want your user to get access to the cache data based on the connectivity, of course you create two different data sources, and in repository, then you decide based on this connectivity where to send, which one to get and send it up. So, and how does it work in from top to bottom? So as you see here, the suggestion is, what we did is that the presentation layer get everything from application, and the application goes to domain and infrastructure. So, and the first thing in infrastructure that is, and the application is working from that is, sorry, I got a message and then I was distracted. So, and it's a repository. So, and then the infrastructure, of course, they know about the domain. So what kind of functions we need to implement, and what is our entities, and these models should, what should that do that, and those kind of things. And if the suggestion here and what we did is here, so if you need to get access to some data, for instance, catalog is a main subdomain in this app, right? So you need to get access to the catalogs, to the product catalogs. So the sales can get access not through all the other layers, but you create a tiny things like API, and you expose those things that you want others to get access to it. And that API will remain same, even though you're changing underneath everything. So for instance, if your data sources is changing from serializing from JSON to I don't know, from maybe XML, that does not affect any other layers. So just in one layer and one tiny part, and then the API, everyone else, every other subdomains, they are safe and fine. But the good thing about this is that we created a lot of encapsulated packages in our repository. We have local packages in the app, and you could create local packages, and then if you create a second app or third app, so simply you can use these packages. That is a great way of decomposing your application to smaller pieces. But how about the smaller app? This is a lot of layers and a lot of boilerplate code for a smaller app, right? Maybe my app is smaller and I just need to leverage, but not that much. Because, you know, if you're developing a very simple app, maybe 20, 30 screens, then why should you even do all of this? Maybe you should go simpler. Yes, I propose two-layer architecture here, and the presentation layer, as we discussed, but with less headache. The thing is that you create your screen, and you definitely use BloC here. And BloC in this matter works very well, because in each screen you can have your own state management with BloC, and that is encapsulated into the screen. That is the best way of decomposing your small piece of application into the subdomains, let's say. So my recommendation and what I did and works very well is BloC, and of course we have an awesome developer on the call right now. So he's gonna elaborate about that soon. So the second, and just the second layer is logic. And the logic layer, I'm proposing to create your repositories and business logic here. If you want to change anything and you want to send it up to your BloC in that case, and your screen can get access to that. So repositories are where you are combining again all of those data sources and merging and then sending up and also adding your logic and then send the state to your BloC, and BloC can send it over to screen to update the UI. And a shared layer between all of that is, because your app is small, maybe not too many data sources, is just a data layer for all of them. So you don't need to create probably an encapsulated layer for each of these subdomains. That could be like a general data layer, and then you could have your data sources, remote or local, and then your models to serialize and deserialize your data sources. Way smaller, like 2-layer presentation logic. You can simply create your application, you decompose your application to a smaller piece, and then you have your data layer and get the data and send it up to other layers. Very simple. Let's quickly look at these links will be hopefully posted to the Twitch or other stream places. Also, I will tweet these slides afterwards, so you can get access to everything, no worries. But that is the URL I created for my demo app. Very quickly, let's go through it. The advanced or enterprise architecture, this is how we decompose. That is one example, the catalog. As you see here, that is very, one of the criticizers I get in Flutter Europe, people came to me and said, it's too many folders here. So of course, that is my probably and my team taste. But if you don't like this folder and the structure, feel free to just remove them and add your name to files and then have a flat folder. The most important thing is that you should know about these layers and you should interact with them accordingly. That is important. But how you structure it or different way, it's totally up to you. Be inspired, as I said. So let's go to the simple one. And the simple one, as you see, is very simple. Here we have a presentation layer for catalog, and that has 2 screens, and each screen has its own state management, which is BloC. As I said, it works very well in this architecture, and I strongly recommend it. And then you have your shared module, common. Put your common module and widgets over there, and then use it in different subdomains. And then you have data sources, which is shared again. I don't have to talk about dependency injection in these architectures because it is also very important how you manage these dependencies. But of course, you have time on your free time, go through the GitHub and also my presentation time to time and try to go back to it and learn about it. Maybe you come up with other ideas too. And if you have any question regarding the dependency injection, just tweet me. I will definitely answer. As I said here, this is not hard rules. That is only a guidance for you, and I believe that we should let DDD guide us, not just tell us what to do exactly. So just be inspired and follow your way to implement that things. And what we learned today, quickly, we went through DDD and the main important terms in DDD, and we went through the strategic part of it, so how we could use some of this and decompose our application, and we then see some architecture inspired by those ideas. And by that said, thank you very much again to listening to me. If you have any question later, tweet me or send me an email. I'll definitely answer your question. That is the link to the slides if you want to go back to it. I will definitely also tweet it afterwards. And I don't want to keep Felix waiting. He has a lot to say about BloC. I'm very passionate right now to just see him. So I'm done.
Majid, there's I just posted a link where the audience could ask questions, so you can open that.
Or should I open it?
Questions? You can see it in Twitch, but I can also post it here. Wait.
Actually, I don't have Twitch open, so because I don't want to see myself delayed a little bit.
I just posted it in this.
Okay.
Here. All right.
So the first one, while domain-driven design provide many technical benefits, do you mean this one?
Yes.
Okay. While domain-driven design provide many technical benefits, it should be applied only to complex domains. What do you think? Well, I said, I think in the beginning of the talk, I agree. So the domain-driven design usually is there for those apps that have a lot of business logic complexity. But if your app doesn't have that, definitely don't go for that. But I also mentioned that although it's designed for those complex apps, but nothing stops us to learn from those good ideas and then use it in our application, right? Like decomposing and making a smaller piece of the application to be more maintainable. It's a good practice. Why not doing that? That is exactly my point in this talk. So we should do that. That is my understanding of these DDD, at least. Many actually argue that DDD is not for front-end too. I also argue that it's not for front-end maybe, but we can take a good part of it and then apply to front-end too. So front-end is also like, because people write JavaScript doesn't mean that they don't write code. They also write code, so they can have like a decomposed version of the application, smaller pieces, and then maintain that and scale that better, of course. Should I go through all of these questions? That means like
I guess just pick some of them, but if you have the time, ask them.
Yes, yeah, of course I have time. I'm not sure how much time you have or Felix have. So I can answer some of them maybe. I can randomly. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So let's answer this question. So someone asked that, can you give an example where DDD is not really applicable? Of course. Like if you're creating a Twitter app similar to Twitter, don't use DDD. So Twitter definitely doesn't have that much business logic, for instance. It has more algorithm complexity, or let's say technical complexity, and maybe performance complexity. So you need your app to work very fast, you know, compared to be so modular. But take the good part of this DDD and may apply to those applications too. But deeply go through DDD for all apps doesn't work, as I said. If you're creating like a very big app or software to create an ERP, that is definitely where you should look into the DDD. Do you write unit tests during the development of Flutter app, and what is your thinking process? Well, of course I write unit test. And in the architecture, my time was a little bit limited, so I couldn't mention that. But there are parts of the application that you definitely need to test. For instance, maybe the domain layer, where all of your main important logic, or the logic layer in the simple app, where all the important logic it's there, the unit test is necessary. I'm not also a big fan of maybe 100% test coverage. Maybe you can go lower, maybe 80% or something, but it's important to test those pieces of application that has the critical part of your application, especially the logic layer, or let's say the domain layer. Also, regarding the TDD, so many ask me, okay, if TDD works with the domain-driven, of course it works. If you like TDD style, if you write test before writing code, that works very well. And if you write code and then test, that also works very well. Combination of both works very well. So that means maybe sometimes when you know exactly what you want to do, and you have your plan, the TDD works very well. You don't maybe lose that much time. But if you don't have, you're experimenting with API, let's say, is this working, or maybe something else, or maybe something else? And that's where you probably should write your code and then test it later when you know exactly the code is done, right? So you don't waste time to just fix the test, even if you don't know what you are going to do at all. That is my understanding. So Felix maybe can elaborate on that later. Why the application layer talks directly to the infrastructure? Wouldn't be better if talks only to domain layer? Domain layer is domain layer is a core of your application. So that is isolated, right? But the domain layer should tell other layers what is inside this layer and what are those interfaces, what are those entities and models and value keys, right? So that the application layer goes to the infrastructure because it needs to get data from somewhere, and the repository where you combine all of those data sources and add your logic to it to send it up is where it needs to get access to. And it goes to domain layer because it needs to know what should get access to, what is the entity to get it. We'll get it or we receive it later, you know? That's the reason. Why do you think about 100 megabyte Google Store limited? I don't think this is the DDD. What was your test strategy? We used both, as I mentioned, the TDD and code first, test later. So some part of our application was fairly clear, and we wrote TDD, but some part of the application wasn't clear, and we were experimenting to evolve the API, and then we wrote code. Then we tested when it was confirmed.
Okay. I think you explained very well. You answered very well to all the questions, or nearly all the questions. Let's make a clear cut right now here,
sure.
Maybe. For the audience, we will have a short break of 5 to 10 minutes, let's say 10 minutes, to simply regain energies, get some drinks or something to eat, and we'll see back here in 10 minutes. So thank you all for joining. Thanks, Majid, for this great talk.
Thank you.
See you back in a minute.
See ya.
Hey, I think we are back. Can you hear me and see me and Felix?
Hello,
Some
testing.
feedback from the chat? No one's answering.
Uh-oh. They're all like, we've seen Majid's amazing talk, so we're good now.
Okay, hi Felix. So you hear us, folks? Do a thumbs up or something. Hit me hard. Okay, Marco, do you think that we can go? Okay, let's simply start. So, thanks again. I hope you got some drinks, something to eat. You regained your energies. I'd like to introduce to you Felix. Oh, I forgot again. I have to switch places. Let's go from Oslo to Chicago.
Yeah, gloomy Chicago. Hello, everyone.
Okay, Felix, thanks for joining us.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you're one of the great maintainers of the Flutter community, in my opinion. You maintain the Flutter libraries, which make it easy to implement the BloC pattern in your Flutter application. So yeah, I just send over the word to you. Introduce yourself, and thanks for being here.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for having me. So yeah, I'll do a quick intro. As you mentioned, my name's Felix Angelov. I'm a software engineer currently working at Very Good Ventures. So for those of you who don't know, Very Good Ventures, they made the Hamilton application, and they were like one of the first companies like focused strictly on building mobile applications in Flutter. So they do like pretty much everything from building apps from scratch in Flutter to helping augment existing companies who are trying to transition into Flutter. So if you have any questions about any of that, feel free to reach out to me. And before that, I was at BMW, and I was fortunate enough to help BMW go through their transformation of going from two code bases, one iOS and one Android, into Flutter. So we had that opportunity to go over the course of like a year and a half, rewrite the entire BMW connected mobile application in Flutter. And a lot of what you'll see in this talk basically came out of that period of time where we were trying Flutter early on before it was even 1.0 and experimenting with different ways to structure our apps and manage state and that type of thing. So yeah, that's pretty much a quick summary about me. And today we're going to be talking about, I want to start off just talking about like the BloC pattern itself, like what is the pattern really, and then how does the BloC library fit into that pattern, and then hopefully do some live coding. I will try to make this presentation more live coding oriented, and if you're curious to see like a more like slide driven presentation, I'd encourage you to check out the Flutter Europe talk, and I'll have a link for that at the very end, so you can check that out on YouTube, or you can look at the slides. So yeah, without further ado, let's get started. So for those of you who don't know, as Majid mentioned, like the BloC pattern is something that is pretty prevalent in the Flutter community. It was one of like the earlier patterns proposed by Google for how to manage state and decouple UI from business logic. And it's kind of like this just theoretical concept, or at least that's how it started off. And there are like a couple of rules that you had to follow just so that you had this like BloC component. And I tried to like find those rules and enumerate them to the best of my ability. And so like in general, we can define a block in this BloC pattern context as being a component that basically separates its logic and is encapsulated like totally in isolation. It has no idea what platform it's running on. It has no idea if it's Flutter on the other end consuming it, or if it's Angular Dart, or if it's a Dart CLI. So it's removed as far as possible from the UI layer. It relies on sinks and streams. So for those of you who are familiar with like asynchronous programming in Dart, you'll use sinks and streams to basically represent a continuous flow of data in your application, as opposed to futures, which are just like one-time asynchronous operations. And then like, obviously we want the blocks to be platform independent and environment independent. So like one of the main things that the BloC pattern was trying to accomplish early on was we wanted to be able to share code between Angular, Dart, and Flutter, since Flutter for Web didn't exist early on. And so that was like a really cool thing that you got out of using this pattern, was like you can reuse like maybe 75% of your logic in your application and just rewrite the front end. And then, yeah, you don't have to take that like step of converting everything over from like Angular, Dart to Flutter. So you get more of a true cross-platform experience. And so if we had to draw like a little diagram, this is like, I'm not a great artist, but I tried to kind of make a diagram showing you what the BloC pattern kind of might look like. So like in the center, we have our business logic component, right? And then we can have widgets or whatever it is on the other side. It doesn't have to be widgets, like I mentioned, that are pumping events into this BloC and notifying it like, hey, this happened, that happened, whatever. The BloC then says like, okay, widget 1 gave me whatever information. I'm going to do something with it, and I'm going to push it out from the other end and have this stream that anyone on the other end can listen to. So it could be that like the same widget is adding and listening. It could be that one widget is adding and another widget is listening. It's very flexible, and like you can see how this could be really useful in terms of isolating the logic. None of these components really know what's happening inside of this box. They just say like, here, take whatever piece of information that you need, and then on the other end, give me the result back. And so with that pattern, we can basically see an example of a potential implementation of this. Don't worry too much about like every single line of code and understanding it, but like this is kind of describing our progression at BMW and continuing at VGV of how BloC, like how our experiences shaped where we are today. And so initially we started off saying like, this is a cool pattern and we think it's really powerful. And obviously like Google's using it internally and stuff like that. We see all the advantages. So let's give it a try and let's try to implement it. And we tried implementing it with RxDart at the beginning. So we used behavior subjects and publish subjects. And then we basically take this like super simple counter example, right? Like the traditional create or Flutter create gives you that counter application where you can just click on a floating action button and increase a number. And so if we were to basically create a BloC for this, we can have the value of our count, and then we can expose a stream that anyone can listen to who cares about what the value of that counter is. And we can expose a sync to anyone who wants to be able to make changes to that counter. But no one knows actually what happens when the sync has something added to it. They just basically listen on the other end to the stream, and then they react to whatever comes out of that stream. And so we encapsulate this logic, which in this case is just this one line where we're incrementing our counter and then pushing it out on the stream. And everything works really nicely. But there were a couple of things that we weren't super thrilled with. Like, I don't know if people are familiar with RxDart or like reactive programming in general, but it can get really complex, especially for people who aren't familiar with it. And at a large scale, it's really important to have all your developers feel comfortable with the tooling that you're using, in my opinion. And so like the steep learning curve of reactive programming was kind of a turnoff for us because we had bad experiences in the past of like, oh, we use Rx Swift everywhere in our iOS code bases. And like, it basically like becomes a mess at some point if you don't really like try to be diligent and maintain like a unidirectional data flow and like keeping your subjects private and stuff like that. Like it can get really messy. So that was one concern that we had. And then the other one was this like memory management or resource management piece where we have to always be careful about not forgetting to close our subjects and cancel subscriptions and things like that. And it's just like a manual step that's really easy to forget. And so like, we're kind of like, this is really cool, but at the same time, like there's some things that we would like to improve upon. And if we looked at like a Flutter application consuming that BloC, we can use the built-in stream builder widget in Flutter within a stateful widget. So we'll create our counter BloC instance. Our stream builder can take the counter stream, which comes out of the BloC, and then use this builder, which comes with the stream builder widget to basically react to any time something is emitted from the stream. And of course, we have to remember to call dispose on our BloC whenever our widget gets disposed so that we can free all the resources and cancel subscriptions and things like that. And so pretty straightforward, like everything works. It accomplishes the goals of separating UI from business logic, but there are some trade-offs like potential increased complexity because of Rx or potentially forgetting to free resources and you deal with async snapshots and forgetting to handle error cases, things like that. So we decided to try to basically take a step back and take the things that we liked from this pattern and abstract them and make our own implementation or interpretation of the pattern. And that's where kind of the BloC library fits into everything. So it consists of a bunch of different packages. There's the core BloC package, which is just the Dart components that gives you actually like the BloC class itself and some other core aspects like what a transition or state change is. I'll talk more about that later. There's a BloC test package, which you would just add as a dev dependency, kind of like the regular Flutter test or Dart test package, and it'll help you write unit tests for your blocks. The Flutter BloC package, which gives you useful widgets to basically kind of like a stream builder and other widgets to basically consume those blocks from within a Flutter application. So they're just like widget helpers, you can think of them as. And then we have a similar thing for Angular Dart with Angular BloC. So if you're building Angular Dart applications, you can still reuse the same block across Flutter and Angular Dart. And before I go on, like it's actually really funny. A few days ago, I just was able to release 4.0. So it's a good time actually if you're interested in trying it, because it'll hopefully there'll be no major changes like anytime soon. So it'll be relatively stable. And even the 4.0 upgrade was really straightforward in my opinion. So if you have any questions, definitely let me know. And I'll have a link to the website where there's like official documentation and examples later. But if you're curious, bloclibrary.dev is where it's all at right now. And so building on top of like the BloC pattern, like the theoretical pattern that I just mentioned, we decided to try to like simplify things and make things a bit more strict. And so in terms of the BloC library, we defined a block as a business logic component that only has one input, so only one sync, and only one output, only one stream. And anytime a UI component or anyone from the presentation layer needs to notify a block of something, it will add an event to the block. And then anytime someone cares about the result of the block or the block state, they will subscribe to the block state stream. And that's pretty much it. You know everything there is to know about BloC, or at least like 95% of it from just this one picture, pretty much. So just keep that in mind the whole time. And as I mentioned, like this works with RxDart. This works with if you use stream controllers. Like this is not particular to the BloC library. You get this nice separation of concerns. So as I mentioned, like if we're using this block in the context of Flutter, the Flutter app has no idea what's going on here. If I just tap on this increment button as a user, the UI layer is telling my block, okay, the user tapped on this increment button. The block is going to do its thing. It's complex business logic. In this case, it'll be like, okay, my previous state was 0. I got an increment event. So let me do some really complex math and say, okay, the next state is going to be 1. I will toss that 1 over the wall to the presentation layer. The presentation layer will be like, oh, cool, I got a new state from the block. It happened to be a 1 this time. So I'm going to update my UI with a 1. And that's pretty much it. So you can swap out the presentation layer. You can swap out the block independently of each other. They're not tightly coupled, which is really cool because you can do things like write an Angular Dart application, as I mentioned, on the left, and a Flutter application on the right using the exact same business logic. And all you have to do is write the UI twice. As long as your use case stays the same, or as long as your feature set stays the same, for the most part, you should be able to reuse almost all of the business logic, which is really cool. Less code we have to write and maintain and test. So it's a big win. And so at this point, I'm going to diverge from the Flutter Europe presentation format and go into some live coding. And I want to make sure everyone can see everything. So can we get like a thumbs up that everyone can read? Let me just open a file. I guess I'll create a file. Can everyone see this, or is it too small?
Yeah,
too big?
I think we can see it.
Okay, cool. Let me make it a tiny bit smaller for myself. So my plan was basically to kind of go through like a production quality counter, if you will, and basically show kind of like what are the typical steps that you would take every single time when making or integrating BloC into an existing application. And so I pretty much just have an empty folder here called Flutter example. Actually, I'm going to even delete this folder and I'm going to go to my desktop and I'm going to run Flutter create. Most of you are probably familiar with this, and I'll just call it BloC example, right? So we're literally starting from scratch. There's no code yet. Let me open up, BloC example in VS Code, and let's get started. So pretty much we have a Flutter application. Oh, or we don't. Where am I? BloC example. There we go. So we have a Flutter application, right? Everyone's probably familiar with this. I always do like the same few things at the very beginning, so bear with me. We're just going to wipe out a lot of these comments, and we're going to basically clean up this app so that it only has the bare minimum that we need. We don't need Cupertino icons. We'll come back to tests, hopefully, if we have time. I'm going to keep material icons for convenience. And yeah, so let's save that up. Flutter packages run, will do its thing. I'm going to delete the test folder for the errors. And let's just start with, we're having my app, and we're not even going to actually touch Flutter. Let's just skip Flutter for a second. So we said blocks are basically decoupled from the platform that they're on. And so for that reason, we can do something like create a directory. We'll call it like packages. And in here, we can basically create a new package. And we'll call this package our counter block. So I can take my pub spec from the previous and just swap it out. We'll say this is a reusable counter block. We won't plan on publishing this yet. And we need to add, instead of a dependency on Flutter, we will add a dependency on the block library. So we said it's at 4.0. And with that, we should be able to save. And we can do the typical create a library because we're going to be reusing this. So we're going to call this counter.dart. Don't worry about all this. You can rewatch, hopefully, this later. Let me call this counter block for consistency. And we're going to now get started actually writing the counter block. So in our source, which is private to our package, we can basically use some snippets that I have, and you can get these snippets too if you use VS Code by just searching for the block extension. Wow, that's huge. But yeah, you can check this out. It has useful snippets, and then it also has some other cool things, like it helps you create blocks from scratch and creates the folder structure for you and everything. So I'm going to do it by hand for the most part so that everyone is like on the same page and following along. But yeah, that's just something that you can do. And of course, VS Code is freaking out, so let me restart it. Yeah, so we're going to start from scratch. We're going to create a counter block, and we have to define our events and our states. So what is our counter block actually going to be converting, right? And so for the sake of simplicity, again, we're going to just say like we're only going to handle one type of event, and it's going to be this increment event. So we're going to define it as an enum. And then it's just going to be converting those events into states. Again, we have to define an initial state. So we'll say our counter starts at 0. And then our block is going to be converting counter events into integers. So that's what this function is doing. So map event to state gets called every single time a block gets a new event. And so we have access to that event. And our responsibility within this function is to convert that event into some sort of new state, potentially. You don't even have to. You can choose to ignore the event if you want to. It's totally up to the block what it decides to do with the event. And so let's fix that so that it's a little bit better. And so now we can basically do a switch in this case because we have an enum, so we can switch on the event. And in the case where it's a counter event dot increment, we can yield state plus 1. And at this point, people are sometimes confused and they're like, okay, where is this magical state coming from? And state is actually a property of this base block class. And it allows you to basically ask the block, hey, at this exact moment in time, what is your state value? And so at the very beginning, it should give us back 0. When we yield state plus 1, if we print what state is right here, it should give us 1. And so you can use the internal state variable to basically emit state changes that depend on previous states. And so in this case, we're just saying we're going to emit whatever our previous state value was plus 1, right? And at that point, we pretty much are done, right? So we can create in our, oh, of course I forgot. I should have created a counter block. This is what happens when you rush a counter block folder. And let's just move all of the stuff inside of counter block because we can have more than one package inside of our packages. So let's just drag those in there. And that's probably why VS Code was getting mad at me earlier too. Okay, so at this point, what you can do with packages is typically you'll see like people put example directories inside of their package so that you can run that package in isolation and see how it's used. So we can create a main.dart in our example. And we can basically define a main function, and we can say we want to create an instance of our counter block that we just defined. Counter block. Did I call it counter block? I did call it counter block. And of course, now that I'm moving folders around, VS Code is freaking out again. Let me restart one last time. Hopefully that's the last time. I've been having analyzer issues recently for some reason, especially when moving directories around. But hopefully now we're good. We have our example. We can hopefully import counter block. Yep. Oh, and I forgot. It's good practice to export the private or the public components that you want available from your library from within that library file. So I want people to have access to the counter block when they use the counter package. And so we should be able to change this to just use our package as a normal package import and not access source, because you shouldn't do that. And so now we can basically do some cool things, like we can say counterblock.listen, and anytime we get a new state from our counter block, we can print. And then we can do stuff like counterblock.add. You guessed it, we only have one event that we support. So now we can basically come into packages, counterblock, example. And if we run this main.dart, we should see, yay, we get 0, 1, 2, 3, right? We're listening anytime the state changes in the block, and we're adding a couple of events to it. So it starts off at 0, and then we add 3 increments to it, and at each point we've updated our counter value. So that's cool. We see again, like, this has nothing to do with Flutter. This is just all Dart code right now. And yeah, so the next thing I think that is cool to go over is there are some hooks that you can use in BloC that give you access to things like anytime an event is added, or anytime a state changes, or anytime an error happens. And so I won't go through in detail for the sake of time, but the most useful one, in my opinion, is this on transition. And it gets fired right before every state change. And the transition contains the current state of the block at the time of the transition. It contains the event that was added to trigger the state change, and then what the next state is going to be. And so we can basically just print transition here. And if I rerun the exact same app, let me collapse this so it's a little easier to read. You'll see we have our initial state gets printed. So that's back here in main. Our initial state gets printed. We add increment, and then that's going to trigger on transition. We see that, okay, our block is changing states from 0 to 1 because of an increment event. And it's changing from 1 to 2 because of another one, and 2 to 3 because of another one. And so you can see, like, it's pretty powerful that you have this one input and one output to your block, and now you're able to basically do things like add universal logging for developers or for analytics or whatever, without having to manually write log statements everywhere. You can just hook into this on transition callback in blocks and print out or log to Firebase Analytics or whatever you want to do anytime a state change happens. And so it's actually funny, like, people were asking TDD, should you write tests first? Should you write tests last? I personally write tests immediately after I write whatever code I've written, and that's just a habit that I've gotten into. I think, like Majid mentioned, like, there's no right or wrong. It's whatever really works well for you. So in this case, I'm going to stay true to the way I do things, and I will write some tests. So we'll create a test folder, and we can do counter block test.dart, because that's the customary way to name everything. It has to end in underscore test. And then just like everything else, we need to have a main function. And now we can start working on our tests. And so in order to write some tests, we need to add dev dependencies to our application. And we'll need the test package for Dart. I don't remember exactly what version it is, so we'll find out in a second. And then I'm going to add a dependency on this block test package that I was mentioning. And so let's take a look at what versions of, so block test, I already know is 5. Let's see what version is test. It's 1.14.2. And this one I should have known. It's 5. So we lock down our dev dependencies. It's just good practice so that you avoid them potentially just like having breaking changes and ruining your CI or whatever locally testing. And so we have our dependencies, and now in our main, the first thing I typically do is I'll create a group, and that group is going to represent the thing that I'm going to be testing. So I'll have one overarching group for the thing I'm writing unit tests for. So in this case, that's going to be our counter block. So we'll have a group, and then we can have some basic test cases, right? Like we can have a test that says initial state is 0, right? We want to make sure that our counter block always starts at 0. So what we can do is we can basically say, I want to expect that when I create a new counter block, its initial state is 0, right? And you can use like the super cool integration with VS Code to run the test directly from your code. Open up our little testing tab. Same thing in Android Studio. I just like VS Code. And there we go. It's booting up, and yay, we have our first test passing. And it's nothing special. Like, you're probably not impressed by this. But the next few tests should hopefully be a little more cool or interesting, at least. And we're going to use the BloC test package to write those tests. And those tests are going to be testing the actual behavior of the block in response to new events, right? So let's say we want to basically test, we're going to make a group just to be organized that's going to be testing for counter event.increment, right? So this group is going to test how the block reacts to this event. And so we can, instead of using the regular test package, we can import the BloC test package. And the BloC test package is built on top of the regular test package, but it makes things a little more structured. And it also gives you some useful like internal functionality that helps like the test give you better feedback if they fail, and also helps make them fail faster. So you don't have timeouts that cause your test to take 30 seconds or whatever before you actually see any logs. So it has some useful things like that built into it. But at the core, it's very similar to the regular test. So if you're familiar with that, hopefully this will be familiar to you as well. So the description, again, we need just like with every other test. In this case, we're going to say when our counter block has the counter event.increment added, it will emit basically 1, right? Because it's going to start at 0. And now we can basically say our block test is going to be testing what block? It's going to be testing an instance of a counter block. So build in the BloC test is just responsible for setting up your test and returning whatever block is going to be tested. Then we have our act, and act is going to basically take the output of build, so whatever block we return counter block, give it to you, and then here you can do whatever you want to that block. So we're going to say in our act, we're going to add the increment event. And then the last thing, the most important one, right, our expect. And at this point, we would expect our block to have emitted a 1. And so every single test, it's nice using BloC tests, in my opinion, because they will all look the same regardless of how complex your block is. Like you can take something really complex or something really simple, and the structure will always follow this same 3 parts: build, act, expect, build, act, expect. And so we can run it just like a regular test, and fingers crossed, yay, everything works properly. So we have counter block, counter event emits 1. And we can do other things with BloC test where we can like chain multiple events, right? Like we can do multiple adds, right? So we'll add 2 counter event, if I can type, and increment. And so we're basically chaining these. We can rewrite this a little bit to be easier to read. Maybe. Let me make this smaller. And so, yeah, so what is this complaining about here? Oh, we need to make it async. Yeah, okay, cool. And so, yeah, we're going to add multiple events here, and now we're going to expect, instead of just 1, we're going to expect 1 and 2 to be emitted. I should have changed the description. 1, 2, when multiple, whatever, events are added. You get the idea. And so with this pattern, you can basically write your block or write the test first, whichever you prefer, and have confidence that the business logic that you've just written inside of the block is working properly. In more complex cases, when your block has dependencies, you can use things like Mockito to mock those dependencies and then just inject a mock into your block. And you can do things like, well, let me leave that for a second. But let's say we had, just for the sake of example, our block has a dependency on some like counter service or counter repository. We can say like counter repo equals mock counter repo. using Mockito, we can say like when counter repo dot whatever, I don't know, get count is called, then return or then answer, blah, 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 right? So we're stubbing out whatever our blocks dependency is doing, and then we can basically pass the mock into our block, and then the exact same structure will work. We'll basically be able to mock the block's dependency and test how the block behaves in all of these different scenarios. And so that's all I'll talk about for testing for now, but if you have any questions, definitely reach out. And also, like I mentioned, the blocklibrary.dev docs have some examples that have tests that are like fully unit tested, so you can take a look at those as resources. And yeah, reach out if you have any other questions. And I'll jump, before we get too low on time, into how we would actually integrate this into Flutter now. So I'll close all our windows. We have packages with our counter block. It's a reusable piece of business logic in this case, and it's inside of our Flutter app, right? So we can say, I want our Flutter app to basically have a dependency on our counter block, which lives in packages counter block. We should be able to pull that in, hopefully. Yeah, okay. And then we can also add a dependency on Flutter block, which is also at 4.0 right now. And that will give us the useful widgets that I mentioned that help you bind to blocks in the Flutter application layer. And so with that, we can now focus on the Flutter aspect, right? So we're calling run app. We have, let's just wipe out all this code and start over. We'll start over with our counter app. And we'll say our counter app is just a stateless widget for now that returns a material app. And our material app will have home, counter page, right? We have some page. Let's just define counter page down below so it doesn't yell at me. And then let's return a scaffold with some body just so we can make sure everything is working. Hello. Right. And I'm going to try running this on web. So wish me luck. Flutter. So I'm on the beta channel. And I should be able to do Flutter run on Chrome. And if all goes well, we will see our Flutter web app that has just a scaffold with hello centered. And then we'll see how to actually pull in the counter block and consume it from Flutter. All right, got our Flutter app booted up. Yay, we have hello. Let me split screen it. All right, let's collapse. So now I guess the first thing we need to do is we need to basically create an instance of the counter block that we had and provide it to our application so that we can have access to it throughout the widget tree, right? One approach you could do is you can make this a stateful widget. Let's say our counter page needs a counter block, right? And we could create counter block, whatever, right? Counter block, and then we could also override dispose and say counter block.close. And that's totally valid, and that's something that like makes sense for some cases where you want the block to only be encapsulated within this one widget. And totally valid, like definitely that's a perfectly fine approach. What I'm gonna do instead though is the Flutter block package depends on provider. So if you're familiar with provider, it's a wrapper around inherited widget and it allows you to provide pretty much anything to your widget tree. And so coming out of the Flutter block package, there's a block provider, which basically just allows you to provide blocks to your widget tree. And so we can say like our counter block needs to have access to a block. And how are we going to get access to it? We're going to get access to it using block provider from the Flutter block package. And block provider, similar to other providers, gives you an API to create things. In this case, we're not going to use the context, but you have access to a build context if you need to look things up in order to create the block. But in our case, we don't need to look anything up. Our counter block has no dependencies on anything, so we can just create it. And what we've done just now is we've made it possible to anywhere from counterpage or counterpage's children look up the same instance of counter block that we've just created in our counter application. And so we can do something like, if we want to, instead of hello, get the value of the counter that we have, we can do context.block, counter block, and then we can say give us the state, right? And we need to convert it to a string. I guess I'll just put a toString in at the end for now. No, this is kind of ugly, but bear with me. Let me format this a bit. So now we have our text widget that's asking the counter block when build gets called, what is your state, and rendering it as the text inside. So if I do a hot restart, we'll see, yay, we see the 0. Let me give this some styling, some style so we can make this a little bigger. So I'm just accessing the text theme from the theme, and I'm going to make this like a headline, I don't know, headline 2. There you go. So you see a nice big counter. And this is cool, but now if for some reason our counter changes, it's not going to notify the counter page to actually update the value, because it's only being asked for the value once when build is called. And maybe the next time, if we get lucky, when build gets called again, we'll get an updated value, but we're not in control right now of when build is called. So in order to actually make this a bit more reactive and hook up to the stream of the block, instead of looking it up like this, we're going to use a widget called block builder. And block builder is exactly like stream builder. So I'm actually going to use the snippet for stream builder, replace stream with block, and we just need to give it, well, let's do it manually first. I'll show you, I'll show you a couple ways to do this. So a block builder, instead of a stream, it takes a block, right? So we said we can look up our block by saying context.block, counter block, right? This is also equivalent to doing, if some of you are more familiar with the syntax, block provider of counter block context. So those two lines are exactly the same. This one's just a little less typing using extensions. So I typically try to type a little less, so I use that approach. And so we're saying, okay, block builder, I want you to subscribe to the state of our counter block. And anytime our block state changes, I want you to call our builder, and builder has access to state, right? So we can call state.toString instead. And I should be able to see a hot restart, and yay, we see 0 again. Nothing has changed. We can actually change this to use string interpolation. And let me restart, make sure that Flutter Web is cooperating. Cool. And so, yeah, so we saw how we can bind to the stream of the block. And now you can actually, since we're using block provider, we don't even need to provide this line. As long as we tell the block builder, hey, I want you to listen for changes in a counter block that convert or that handles integers as its state. And internally, block builder will do this lookup for you. And so that's one less line that we can avoid having to type. So we can hot restart again, and hopefully everything is gonna update. Yeah, cool. And now the last part is like, okay, how can we wire this up to actually add events to it? And so for that, we can just use the nice built-in floating action button, as everyone is familiar with probably, where we'll just give it a child with some icon, icons.add, and then most importantly, the onPressed, right? And so onPressed, again, we can look up our block, right? Counter block, and then we can say, I want to add counter event.increment to you. And so now what we're saying is, oops, there we go. Let me make this a little bit bigger. Now what we're saying is every time we tap on our floating action button, we're going to look up the block, and Flutter Web just died. We're going to look up the block from build context, and we're going to add the increment event to it. And ideally, our block builder is always listening. So our block will do its thing. It's going to compute what the next state should be. And then when that happens, block builder will get the update and return a text widget. So once it fires back up, we should be able to see end-to-end everything working, hopefully. We should see a floating action button, yeah. And if I press it, I can see the state changes, yay. And in like the last 5 minutes, I will quickly try to introduce the concept of block delegate. And so block delegate is basically a way to kind of type less code and still get those transition callbacks that I was mentioning in the counter block. So if we look at counter block again, we override this on transition here, right? And so if I actually open up the console in my Flutter web app, we can see like every time I click on the button, I'm getting transitions logs. That's pretty cool. But if you have like 50 blocks in your application and you're building a huge enterprise app like Majid was talking about, it's going to be really annoying to have to write the same code in each of these blocks. So we can actually remove that override. We can create, I don't recommend doing all this in one file, but just for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to do it in one file. We have a snippet for my BloC delegate, call it whatever we want. And all we have to remember is we have to extend this BloC delegate that comes from the BloC package, the pure Dart package. Again, this has nothing to do with Flutter yet. And so in here, we have access to these overrides. Anytime an event is added, we can print it. Anytime an error happens, we can print it. Anytime a transition happens, we can print it. And these are all optional. So again, I'm going to get rid of those just for the sake of simplicity. And I'm going to just print the transition, right? So nothing should change, but we need to remember to initialize the delegate, my BloC delegate, right? And so with those changes, I should be able to do a hot restart, taking an unexpectedly long time. Hot restart, come on. Yay, okay. And I should still see my transitions, even though I only overrode on transition function once for every single block using BloC delegate. And so you can think about like, okay, maybe I want to pass some sort of logger, right? And maybe in development, this logger could just be like a facade or an abstract class or an interface. And maybe in development, we pass like a logger that just prints to the console like I'm doing here, but in production, we log to Firebase Analytics, right? So instead of print, we would call like logger.log, whatever. We have access to also the block itself. So if we modify the log statement, we can say also block.runtime type and then transition. And so let me fix this so that we don't have errors. Do a hot restart, go back to web. And we see now not only do we have, can I make this bigger? Yeah, there we go. Not only do I have the transition that happened, but I also have access to the block that was responsible for that transition. So you can see with very little code, like you can build a pretty robust set of like, or a system for analytics and developer logs. And also it'll help you debug potentially issues if you can get like reports from consumers saying like, oh, this app got in a really weird buggy state. You can take all of these logs for the user and see exactly how they got to the state that they got to, and then play that back without having to constantly go back and forth and like ask for videos or ask for reproduction steps or that type of thing. You have your reproduction steps because you have this like transaction log basically for your entire application. And hopefully that was, I know that was a lot, but hopefully it gets you like a good high level overview of like what it takes to actually build and test blocks. So just to recap, we fully unit tested our counter block. I know it's very simple, but we've still done it, so that's something. And we've integrated it into a Flutter application, and we've gotten logging for free pretty much with just this little bit of code right here. And yeah, and it works on web, which is awesome. So I will switch back to the slides. I only have like 2 more slides. So the only things I want to add are, as I mentioned earlier, you can check out bloclibrary.dev. It has like lots of like written documents explaining like core concepts again. So if you thought this talk was like really fast, you can go through and read those at your own pace, or you can watch like the Flutter Europe talk at your own pace. If you want to go like slide by slide, I talk about every single widget one by one and show like snippets one at a time instead of live coding through everything. So it'll be a bit easier to go through everything at your own pace. There's also a lot of example applications at bloclibrary.dev with tutorials. So like if you're interested in implementing Firebase or implementing login with Firebase auth using BloC, there's an example app. If you want to do a GitHub search application using the real GitHub API with BloC, you can see the example. And there's so many more like to-dos from Brian Egan's architecture samples. There's a weather application using a free weather API. So it'll give you somewhat reliable weather data, but it is integrated with an API and fully unit tested. So there's lots of examples to look at for inspiration. And lastly, I just want to say thank you for everyone who tuned in. I know it's Friday, and I really appreciate everyone taking their time to join the meetup and check it out. And hopefully everyone's staying safe. It's crazy out there, but hopefully everyone's staying safe and helping each other out as they can. And yeah, with that, I'll end it. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Felix. It was great.
No problem. Should we go through questions?
Yeah. That'd be great. Do you have the link? Okay.
Yes, I'm at the link right now. So we have, it seems BloC has two responsibilities: handle states and events and handle logic. Do you think it's better to handle logic with a different controller? I'm not sure I fully understand, but I would think of it as like the BloC's only responsibility is to transform events into states. So if you think about it that way, it's basically just like a slightly more powerful stream controller. So it's taking one type of input and converting it or transforming it into a different type of output. So hopefully that answered your question. I typically don't handle logic in a different controller. I think the BloC's responsibility should be to actually have the logic for how to transform the events into the states. Hopefully that answers your question. Next we have, do you use mocks in Flutter? Can you recommend a good one? So if everyone can still see my screen, I highly recommend using, I mentioned it briefly, Mockito. Works really well. And basically what it allows you to do is it allows you to say like, let me find a good example. So let's say we have a class cat, right? And we want to test a block which depends on this class cat for some reason. We don't want our block in our test to have a real instance of class cat, because then we can't really control how the class cat behaves. So instead we can create a mock cat, and all you have to do to create a mock is just this one line of code. Say, what's my mock class's name? You have to extend mock, which comes from the Mockito package, and then what interface it's implementing. So in this case, it's this cat interface. And then we can just create an instance of a mock cat object. And then later we can do things like when someone calls cat.sound, we're going to hijack that call. And then instead of returning what it would normally return, we're going to return per, for example. So you have really good control over the dependencies of the thing that you're testing. And I highly recommend it. It's really awesome. And the API is really straightforward in my opinion. So definitely check it out. Next we have, when did you start to develop the BloC library? How long did it take to do from the first release? Okay, so I started developing, I mean, we can check actually. I think it was like October. Let's just quickly check. October of 2018, maybe? I don't even remember. It's been a while. But it was... Oh yeah, October 2018. And actually it didn't take long from when we had the idea to when we actually published the first release, because if you actually look at how much code, at that point there was just the BloC package. There was no like Flutter BloC, Angular BloC, all that stuff. It was just the BloC package. And the code, if you look at it on GitHub, there's more comments and documentation than there is like actual Dart code. It's very simple, and you can definitely like fork it and check out the code. But it didn't take that long to like get the proof of concept out. And then it's taken a lot longer, honestly, to iterate and like gather feedback from the community, build out comprehensive documentation and examples. I think that's been like the really time consuming part. But luckily I've had a lot of help from the community. People have contributed examples, documentation, even offered to translate the documentation into different languages. So if you're ever interested in trying to help, there's plenty of things that we could use help with. So just reach out. We have, why don't you use Android Studio? I guess I'm just used to VS Code. I think both are good. In my opinion, Android Studio is a bit heavier. I find my computer struggles a bit more when I use Android Studio than VS Code. And I also like, I used to do a lot of web development and use TypeScript and Node before. And like, I found it really seamless to be able to use VS Code and switch between Flutter and Dart and TypeScript or JavaScript. And like, you can just control what plugins and extensions you have. Also, I'm a little biased because I have to maintain plugins and extensions for both Android Studio and VS Code for the BloC stuff that I showed you. And it's a lot easier, in my opinion. I had a better developer experience building plugins for VS Code than for IntelliJ. So I think it's a lot easier to build out tooling, which also like makes me use VS Code a bit more. But I definitely think both are really powerful. They're almost at feature parity, I think. So you should be able to accomplish the same thing using both of them. And I'd say like use whichever one you're most comfortable with. We have, what option is best for BloC state representation? So this is a good question. This comes up a lot. I think the hardest part about BloC actually is like coming up with how you're going to represent your state, and also coming up with how you're going to name your states and how you're going to name your events. Actually, writing the business logic is usually easier, but the naming and the representation of the state is the hardest part. And so what I would say is basically you need to think about like the use case, right? Like if my use case or my like feature can be in a loading state and have data at the same time, like if that is technically possible, then it probably doesn't make sense to represent your state in terms of different subclasses. It probably makes sense to have like one base state class that has like maybe a status enum for like I could be loading, loaded, or have an error or whatever. But if there are cases where like it's impossible to be loading and have data at the same time, like that is just going to violate like the entire definition of the feature or use case, then I think it makes sense to represent your state using subclasses and have a base, like abstract base class for the like customer state in this case you have, and then have a customer loading, loaded, error that extend from that, because you want to make it impossible to get into these like weird scenarios where the case makes no sense, right? Like if we had one base class for this case that has loading and data, and we said it was impossible to both be in a loading state and have data, technically that is still representable. It's possible to represent that in code. And so you want to just model in a way that is impossible to run into cases that should not be possible, I guess. So I think you have to play around. Like I don't think there's one answer for every scenario. You have to just try it and see what feels better. Also, another thing to consider is freezed. I'm not sure if people have checked it out yet, but Remy, who's the maintainer of Provider, he released a library called Freezed, which basically gives you sealed classes and unions pretty much. So it does use code generation behind the scenes. So you do have to use build runner, but it's really handy for basically cases where you have like this inheritance and you always want to make sure that like my state is one of these types. You can use like the when on freezed, and it will basically ensure that you've handled every possible case. You never forgot to handle a loading or like an error case by accident in your UI. So I highly recommend checking that out as well. We have, did you develop the library completely during your regular work, or how much free time? I did not develop it during my regular work because it was not a priority at the time. Actually, like we were just full speed ahead, like working on transitioning our 2 mobile apps into Flutter. And so like we had deadlines that we had to meet and all the usual stuff. So like we couldn't take lots of time to like do a ton of research. Like we had a window at the beginning where we did POCs for Flutter and made sure that we were sure that we wanted to use Flutter, but we didn't have like a ton of free time to investigate like, okay, can we open source things? Actually, BMW was like not really open sourcing a lot at the time. So that was a challenge. And like, we didn't have a lot of time to like say, okay, let's try Redux, block, scope model, blah, 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 and like be able to change our mind later. We wanted to kind of like be agile and like try to be smart and tactical about the approaches we took. So like we started off with Redux. We did like a few months of development with Redux. And then like a bunch of us were like, okay, yeah, this isn't really working. Like we have to teach a bunch of people these concepts that aren't that straightforward. And also like there are cases where it becomes awkward and our global state model becomes super huge and complicated. So can we figure out something else? And so in our free time, we started like experimenting with BloC. We did a lot of extra work to convert to RX, Dart, and BloC. And then again, in our free time, we were like, okay, RX is powerful, but we don't want developers to directly be using RX everywhere because it'll cause like spaghetti code in the long term if we're not careful. And so then again, in our free time, we were like, how can we come up with an abstraction for all of this? And I think like it worked out. I mean, we spent a lot of extra hours, but it was good to see that it was helping the community as well. It wasn't just internal. And I think it also opened the door for BMW as a company to consider open source more. And they started open sourcing a lot of other Flutter packages. So you can check out BMW Tech at GitHub, and they have like an open source mapping package and some like a logger. They have some testing packages. So it's pretty cool that we kind of changed the mindset there by doing that. And we have, would you agree that BloC should contain only pure Dart code? Yes, I think that's a big thing. Like I see people trying to handle navigation in blocks and they'll pass in a build context. I'll see people handling like animations and they'll try to access like animation controllers inside of a block. And I'd say ideally you should be able to remove your block from your Flutter app and drop it into an Angular Dart app, and you shouldn't have to change anything in your block code. I guess that's like a very pure way of thinking about it. So like definitely you might say like, oh, I already know I'm never going to need Angular Dart, so it's okay to couple it to Flutter. But I think like there's value in keeping it pure Dart. Like You can extract it into its own package. You can write pure Dart tests for it. You don't need like the Flutter SDK just so that you have this piece of business logic that really doesn't care, or it shouldn't care about the presentation layer. So I would say like definitely try to keep the blocks pure Dart. And that's why like it might seem like overkill that I pulled it out into its own package, but really doing this kind of makes it easier to see those things, because I can easily see like I only have a dependency on the Dart SDK. I don't have a dependency on Flutter, right? Like it's really obvious if someone opens a PR now and says, oh, I'm going to add Flutter to my block. And then everyone will be like, whoa, 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 why are you adding Flutter to your block? And you can have that conversation. So I think separating things out that way helps enforce that separation of dependencies. And then how do you measure performance of your library? That's a good question. So you can do it a number of ways. Like I initially had benchmark tests that I was writing using a package called benchmark. Let me see if it still exists. Benchmark harness. Yeah, so you can check it out. It's not very popular, but it allows you to basically specify like what code you want executed, and then run this like benchmark harness and specify how many times you want it to run. And then it'll give you a bunch of like statistics about like the average execution time, max execution time, tons of stuff. So you can analyze and even integrate into the pipeline. Also, I think another good measure is like building apps using BloC, like for example, building Flutter apps that use it, and then you can profile those using the regular profiling tools that are pretty powerful, and the Flutter team has done a lot of work to improve. You should definitely check out Philip Rossick's talk. He's one of the Flutter GDE DevRel. He's on the DevRel team, and he had an awesome talk at Flutter Europe that's on YouTube that you can check out about how to profile for performance and find out where performance issues are happening and how to fix them. So yeah, the built-in tooling is really, really helpful for that. But like this package is also kind of useful for just like in isolation, doing some simple benchmarks. So you can check that out as well. And it's maintained by Google employees as well. Cool. I think that's all the questions that I see so far.
Great. Thanks, Felix.
Yeah,
this was a great talk. A lot of insights in the library and pretty good explained from 0 to 100. So
yeah, hopefully it wasn't too much. Hopefully it was a good overview.
Yeah, I think so. And thank you very much. I hope you have a great day. I think in the US it's
yeah, we still have some time. Yeah. Have a great evening for you, right?
Yeah, you too. Yeah. And thank for you. The audience, I will quickly post a Jitsi Meet link. So for all who actually want to join us, want to talk a bit later, just come into this room, join us there, and we can talk. And yeah, we'll see each other there.
Awesome.
So thank you to have so many people here from all over the world. Let's make this worldwide right now. So bam, 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 bam.
Travel the world.
Yes. Thank you very much again. So see you on Jitsi in a minute, or if not, elsewhere.
Oh, and I'll send the links to those resources too, if anyone's interested, and we can share those.